In part 1 of this series, we identified a problem with the conception of God as a summum bonum, as the greatest good. Despite my best efforts, and I'm serious when I say my best efforts, I cannot gloss over the fact that God's behaviour is intolerable from an ethical standpoint. Such a conclusion sounds outright blasphemous, and I would have thought the exact same thing until I was blatantly confronted with the reality. Like I mentioned in part 1, when these issues arose, I preferred to remain willfully blind. I preferred to ignore them and instead subscribe to some absurd belief such as the definition of evil as a lack of good, or I would subscribe to some secondary symbolic interpretation and believe that this interpretation proved that I could ignore the stark reality. The reason that we find it so difficult to do away with God's representation as everything good, as love itself, is because we conceptualize the divine as a conscious being. If our Creator is a conscious being and something other than the pinnacle towards which all roads lead, something other than the highest good, then we encounter a terrible conundrum. We encounter the inevitable conclusion that even if God exists, He is unworthy of our worship. It then follows that the world is cursed and that any moral or responsible action is naive, or that we can create our own morality and decide what is best, while still others ignore the incongruity of God's actions with His definition as the highest good, and they subscribe to absurd hypotheses such as the ones that we have mentioned, like the definition of evil as the absence of good. But perhaps God is not a conscious being, but a phenomenon. If God is truly the creator of our universe, then God is everything. God is the underlying substructure of our reality. God pervades all things. This would indeed include the embodiment of good itself, the loving Father, Jesus Christ, the man without sin. However, it would also include the terrible suffering and evils which exist in our world, and there is no escaping that fact. This is where the story of Job comes in. So if you don't know the story, here's a brief overview. So Job is described in the Bible as blameless and upright. He is a man who feared God and shunned evil. But then God makes a bet with Satan himself. Satan comes to God and tells him that the only reason that Job is so righteous is because God has put a hedge around him and his household, and He has blessed the work of his hands. God gives Job over to Satan and tells him to do his worst, and that Job will not falter in his fear of God. And God was right. Job loses his children, he loses his wealth, he loses his livestock, he loses his servants, he loses his health. His wife tells him to curse God and die. All of his friends preach to him about how God is right and just, and how all of these terrible things which are happening to him must be a consequence of his wrongdoing. Job must have done something terrible to deserve all of the curses which have been brought upon him. But Job never loses faith in the idea that he has an advocate in heaven. Throughout the story, he endeavours to seek an audience with God. And God comes to him. And you know what God does? God rebukes Job. He says to him, "Do you have an arm like God's? And where were you when I laid the earth's foundations?" We know of the classical interpretation of this story. It signifies that we should never question the Lord, no matter what happens to us, no matter the terrible evils we are confronted with, no matter the suffering that we face in life. We must continue to have faith. We shouldn't even entertain the thought that we deserve an audience with God as Job does, because we are by nature inadequate and unworthy. We should not assume knowledge of the nature of the Lord, because He is transcendent and ineffable. We should only have full faith in His goodness. We should only have full faith that we will receive justice in the end. I am not going to call into question such interpretations, because I believe in such situations man should remain upright. Man should not curse God, regardless of the circumstances that he is faced with. But in order to see how this story is relevant to the topic of this video, we need to consider what this story means for God. Such interpretations as I've mentioned completely ignore the fact that God made a deal with the devil. They completely ignore what this story says about God. We know what it says about an individual who faces the undeserved horrors of life. We know the value that this story provides when we are talking about the individual involved. But we must also consider the apparent unconsciousness of God towards his evil angel Satan. Why does God still blame Job for the bet that he waged with Satan? If God were an omniscient, omnipotent being, why would he rebuke Job? Why would he even need to test Job in the manner that he did? So what are we to make of God rebuking Job? What are we to make of God's apparent unconsciousness of his evil angel? After God has proclaimed his power to Job, Job says to God, "Surely I spoke of things too wonderful for me to know." Job refers here to his pleas for an audience with God. He refers here to the fact that he assumed that God was just and good and tried to seek an audience with him. But then he realizes that maybe he really didn't know enough about God. Maybe God really was too wonderful for him to know. Because Job registers a gnosis of the divine in this moment. He realizes that we can love God, but we must fear him. Jung points out that the story of Job was a truly revolutionary milestone, because no matter what way we look at that story, man wins a moral victory over God. Job realizes that he must fear God, because no matter how blameless and upright you remain, things can still take a horrible turn. Job acted as morally as possible. He was blameless and upright, and he never lost his faith in God. However, God still took everything from him. We see that so many people's lives take a turn in this direction from our news feed every day. If you cannot see that millions of lives have been ravaged, if you cannot see that there is no way we can maintain a view of justice on earth, then you need a serious wake-up call. Our disciplined striving toward the good might be our best bet by a million miles, but it is certainly not always rewarded. Tragedy and undeserved suffering can strike at any minute, hence the need to fear God. Job consciously registers a knowledge of this dual nature of God. Job realizes that the world is not so black and white. Job realizes that justice does not always prevail in this life. Such a revelation could not fail to have far-reaching consequences. Now, this isn't to say that God is evil, nor is it to say that he isn't omniscient and omnipotent. However, there is no amount of roundabout reasoning which could convince us that God has been both fully conscious and the summum bonum throughout the drama which unfurls in the Bible. Never mind the drama that unfurls in the Bible. How about the drama that unfurls in our own lives? How about the drama that unfurls in the lives of those who are much less fortunate than ourselves? Do you think that they see justice on earth? Do you think that what they received as a consequence of their actions was justified? What all of this is saying is that God cannot be understood in human terms. The image of the all-good, all-loving Father that we like to ascribe to God is far from complete. There is no image that we can associate with God. There's no idea or symbol that can fully encompass God. But what Job realizes is that the conception of God as all-good, all-loving Father, a symbol which we like to associate with God, in fact, the symbol that is most associated with God is far from complete. Job realizes that it is wholly insufficient and one-sided to characterize God in such a way, and that is the huge significance of this story. You may be thinking that the conclusions that I introduced in part 1 of this series about the metaphysical reality were the correct ones. You may be thinking that this new God image with a dual nature is certainly not worthy of our worship. Never mind worship, he's not even worthy of our respect. You're probably thinking that belief in universal justice is, as we've said, incredibly naive and just a pipe dream. But don't be so sure of yourself just yet, because the story does not end here. Look out for part 3, where I hope to bring all of these ideas together and finally introduce the alternative viewpoint, which I believe that we should adopt. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you'll join me for part 3 of this series. God bless.